All right. I love when technology works
All
during
right.
COVID. We are live. Hey, John.
Hi,
How are
Priscilla.
you?
Thanks for doing this. It's great.
Good. You had quite a busy morning. Had a meet
Yeah.
and greet this morning, and you're just campaigning.
We're in the final stretch now. I mean, there's no time off. And so, on top of that, my parents came in from Virginia. They drove all the way across country to kind of help out in these last final weeks of the campaign. And they brought their dog, who's a puppy, and mixing it in with my dog, who's like a 16-year-old dog.
Oh,
It's not going great so far, but the kids are loving it.
well, I'm really excited that you carved out some time today for us to have a conversation. I'd love to introduce you to more voters who may not have had a chance to come to one of your live meet and greets during this time of COVID. So we're just
Yeah.
going to rely on the computer to try to reach more people. So before we start our very casual conversation, I want to share a little bit about who you are. You are a former Marine. Sorry, let me get that
Yep.
right. Marine veteran. You spent 10 years in the Marines, but you're now in the reserves. That's pretty amazing. And thank you for your service. You are an Afghanistan veteran as well. So we're really glad that you came home safely. We do have something in common. Both of our dads spent 3 decades in the
Yeah.
military. Your dad spent 30 years in the Marines, and my dad spent almost 30 years in the Army. So we're both Army brats and
Yep.
know what that life is like moving around. And you went to law school at CU Boulder, and you're married to your beautiful wife, and you have 2 kids, and your wife is also an attorney.
Oh
And
yeah.
I'm wondering, like, when you guys have a disagreement, who has the better skills, the debate skills? Who
Uh,
tends to win?
I wonder if she's watching right now. She does, and
Okay.
she's right.
That's the secret, right?
Absolutely.
So you're running for DA in the 18th Judicial, which encompasses 4 counties. Can you name those 4 counties for us?
I certainly can. So it's Arapahoe, Douglas, Elbert, and Lincoln counties. So it's really massive. I mean, you're talking about a jurisdiction the size of the state of Connecticut, 1.1 million people in this jurisdiction. I mean, if you think of like CD6, the congressional district, it's way bigger than that too. So it's the largest judicial district, at least the most populated in the entire state. And I've been working here as a chief deputy DA for the last 8 years serving this community.
So you've been working with George Brockler, who is term limited. And so we're really excited to get to know more about you, and we'll hear more about your journey and a little bit more about your bio as we have this conversation. But what was well, in the Army, we call it what did you do when you were
Okay.
in the Marines?
Yeah, my MOS, my military occupational specialty, I was a judge advocate. So I was a lawyer. And the thing about being a lawyer in the Marine Corps is you don't necessarily specialize like I'm just a prosecutor or I'm just a defense attorney. You know, you start out becoming sort of a jack of all trades. And the idea is that you're an advisor for the commander. And that's what I did when I was deployed overseas in Afghanistan. As I advised the regimental combat team commander on the rules of engagement. I taught the young Marines coming in how to basically follow those rules to make sure that if we're doing this job, we're going to do it right, kind of come home with our honor intact, and help the commander make decisions. And then another part of my job was kind of incredible. I actually lived in Marja, which was this place in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, that was dominated by the Taliban, just one of the Taliban strongholds. And we took it over in 2010. And I lived with the local Afghan prosecutor because they were trying to reestablish like an actual justice system. They didn't have it. I mean, the Taliban, they would come in and they would issue a judgment, and it was usually death, and that was it. Those were kind of the choices for their justice system. So they were trying to rebuild this government, and my job was to partner with the prosecutor, get him out to do his job because he was honestly and understandably afraid, but kind of helped get the rule of law reestablished in this place. And what that did for me was you see just how great our system of justices in the United States compared to other places. I mean, it's imperfect. I get that, but it's something that's worth fighting for, and something worth building on.
So take me back to when you decided that you wanted to be an attorney. Like at, young kids, they decide at an early age something, there was a trigger or an experience. What was that journey like for you to decide that you wanted to be an attorney?
Well, like most people my age, I saw 9/11 happen as a young man. I was, I think I was 19, and I had not wanted to join the Marine Corps before that. So I had, grown up in this lifestyle. My father served 29 years. We bounced around every 2 to 3 years. You know what it's like. It just hard to put down roots. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to have a place where I was like, this is going to be my home. And then when I saw that happen, I really knew that I wanted to serve. I um, ended up becoming a commissioned officer in 2003 once I finished college and my officer candidate school. And they said, hey, it looks like your test scores are pretty good. Do you want to go maybe try to go to law school? And I thought, that's interesting. I'd always liked the idea of it, but it hadn't been something that, was certain this was going to be my path. And as I was kind of going through this process of checking out law schools and thinking about it, I just realized, like, I think this is going to be a way where I can make a real difference. I wanted to be a defense attorney at first, to be honest. I thought that that was going to be my path, but I became a prosecutor in the Marine Corps. And the more I did it, the more I was helping victims and helping people get justice in some of these, unusual cases that I worked on in the Marine Corps, the more and more I loved it. So when I got back from Afghanistan and I was back as a prosecutor, Sarah and I, we wanted to kind of put down our roots somewhere. And she had grown up in Colorado. She was from Arapahoe County. And she's like, well, let's come back. She was here working as a young attorney at a law firm. She's like, you come back from California now and be with me. And I said, yeah, let's definitely do it. And so I started working at the Boulder DA's office for Stan Garnett. And I talk about this sometimes on the campaign trail about how this job shouldn't be really partisan in the way you do it. And, that's just something I really enjoyed working for Stan and learning a lot about his way to approach justice and engage the community. And then when George Brockler came into office, he asked me to join him and start a cold case unit.
Yeah, I think that's really critical for just the average person who might find themselves paying attention to decisions being made in regards to social justice and the DA. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the specific cases that you've had success in. But before we do that, can you explain to the viewers what is the role of a DA?
Yeah, so the district attorney is the chief elected law enforcement officer for a judicial district. And there's, 22 of those districts in the state of Colorado right now. And ours, as I mentioned earlier, is the largest. And really what the job is that when there is a arrest that happens and the police send that information to the prosecutor makes decisions about whether to charge the case, what charges to bring. And then we're the people that go into court, and we have this real privilege. You get to come in and say, John Kellner for the people. And so we're representing the community and trying to seek justice in a criminal case. The DA's office is different than these sort of different levels. There's a city attorney in a lot of bigger cities, and they handle things at like a municipal court where you might get a kind of a ticket from a local police officer. That's not what we do. We handle misdemeanors and felony offenses. So, misdemeanors are cases where people can potentially go to jail, and then felonies are where they could potentially go to prison as an outcome. So, all the way up to things as serious as the Aurora Theater shooting and the trial that went there, the STEM school shooting, really all kinds of murder cases that I've worked on, all the way down to something like a DUI case.
Now, something really impressive that I've learned about you is your experience with the cold cases. And if anybody watches Cold Case, like some of these cases could be dormant for decades. And then here you come along and you open up these cases and you look at all the evidence and you try to solve the case. In particular, you have a few where it resolved a murder of an immigrant or refugee, sorry, refugee. Talk about that case. It's really impressive.
Okay. Yeah. So you mentioned they could be decades old. Absolutely. I mean, to kind of tell you about a different one real quick, we solved a 40-year-old cold case murder. It was a sexual assault, a kidnapping of this young lady who was living in Englewood. She was sexually assaulted and stabbed to death and left in Highlands Ranch. I hope there's no kids watching. But this is the kind of real stuff that we deal with in the DA's office, and work together with law enforcement at the sheriff's office in Douglas County, and they use some of this great new stuff called genetic genealogy to track somebody down that we thought we would never find, and ultimately brought this person to justice. And he was convicted first-degree murder earlier this year during COVID, and we actually had him sentenced to life for that 40-year-old cold case, 1980. But the one you asked about involved a Sudanese refugee, a guy named Yon Malwal. And Yon was a guy who fled Sudan with his wife and some children because of religious persecution. And they came to the United States just trying to live the American dream. I mean, they wanted a safe place to raise their kids. They have 5 children. They're living in Arapahoe County up near Aurora. And he was working multiple jobs. And so he was coming home December 26, 2011. So right after Christmas. And he was working cleaning RTD buses, kind of the late night, the overnight shift. He pulls in around 3 a.m. to his apartment complex, and somebody runs up and shoots him in the head and kills him on the spot. And his wife heard the gunshots. She looks out the window. She sees the light on in his car. She runs out. She calls 911. She's, screaming, as you can understand. And just one of those cases that you look at and it just gnaws at you because you want to help these folks. And so when we came in 2013, started the cold case unit, and I actually ended up bringing this case to a grand jury around 2014 and indicted several people, several gang members. And what we basically learned during this whole process was they were retaliating against some other gang member that had committed a shooting a few days earlier. And our victim drove the same color car and kind of car and lived across the way in the apartment complex from the person they intended to kill. And so it was tough at first, as you can imagine, to kind of connect those dots and put that case together because there was no obvious motive right there. But ultimately we did it. We worked with law enforcement. This is something I'm really proud to have done with the help. It's not just me, like, don't get me wrong, I'm not solving these on my own. It's working together with the police, the Arapahoe County Sheriff's Office, the Aurora Police Department. Ended up convicting 3 of these guys of first-degree murder, and they were sentenced to life in prison for this horrible act. And it was really impactful to me because Mary, the widow of this man, we became real close through this process. And it's more challenging to explain the justice system to somebody who's not from the country to begin with, right? So she had come from a place where her father had basically disappeared in the middle of the night. And think about that. Just somebody abducted and killed her father, and there was no justice. Nobody cared. There was no government that was looking out for her. And to kind of explain this process to her of what to expect in court and about the rights that the defendant has and about the obligations I have as a prosecutor to prove things beyond a reasonable doubt. So, educating her about the system, making her feel confident, and making her feel like, look, we're going to get there. And ultimately we did. It's one of those things where at sentencing, she comes in and she tells the judge about how in America, we have the rule of law. In America, people care. It doesn't matter who you are, what color skin you have, that there's somebody who's going to seek justice for you. To me, it wasn't just about justice for her husband and for her. It gave her this sense of belief in what our country can be and can do. It was big.
I think that's a powerful attribute that you bring to the voters during this time of unrest, racial unrest in our communities where, there people are wanting to see reform. People are wanting to believe in the justice system.
Yeah.
And when they see disparities, it's really important that we elect somebody that will bring that confidence back, right? Bring that assurance that justice will be done in a fair way. And your examples of having done that in a wide variety of cases is really remarkable. And I want to mention that you got some amazing news this morning. This is like a fresh,
Yeah,
hot off the press.
literally not off the press.
Post endorsed you this morning. And that is like a big deal because they vetted the two candidates, and clearly you came out shining with your experience and understanding. And especially in this case where, I think maybe some people might not know what a DA does, or might have a picture in their mind of what like a DA does. Like you just sit back in an office and you don't really understand, but like taking something to a grand jury trial, that is an experience that maybe not a lot of attorneys have or DAs have. Can you talk about like how you are bringing a different, more robust type of experience if you're the next DA?
Yeah, I think the experience matters. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that. I talk about it a lot because, what I bring to the table is somebody who's been prosecutor of the year for the entire state of Colorado from my work seeking justice in cold cases and really combating gang violence in Aurora. And like right now, I mean, I hate to say it, but we have a lot of rising violent crime going on, especially in Aurora, where we're seeing a lot of shootings. We've already had over 35 homicides for the year. I think it's nearly double what we saw in 2018. Not good numbers, and I don't know if it's all COVID related, if it's the economy, these things, but the reality is we're going to have to deal with this. And I've been prosecution team of the year with Mothers Against Drunk Driving for basically aggressively prosecuting a repeat drunk driver who killed a young man in a crosswalk in Aurora. This is a couple years ago. I tried this case, and I tried it as a murder case because, this guy, he just kept on doing this, drinking and driving. He tried to drive away from the scene after killing this young man. And like a little segue here, I mean, this young man, he and his best friend were crossing the street, and he sees this drunk driver basically barreling through. The light's red. It's, he's got the right of way. He should be safe walking across. And he pushes his best friend out of the way, saves his life. And, so Dalton and Career, he didn't make it. And it just felt like, this is a case where we need to make a statement as a community that we're not going to tolerate this sort of thing. So what the voters get in me is somebody who has prosecuted criminal cases his entire career. The last 10 years as a state prosecutor, both in Boulder and our community. And that matters because, some folks talk about the Attorney General's office or the U.S. Attorney's office. Those offices do important work, but the reality is a lot of what they do is called civil law. My wife is a civil litigator, so they might sue a pharmaceutical company for false advertising or something like that. Criminal work, like I do, where you're seeking justice for people, for victims in these real criminal cases, it's a dramatically different thing. We've got different rules, we've got different law, and I'm an expert in that. And I've led not just the Arapahoe District Attorney's Office cold case unit, but I was actually in charge of our largest felony prosecution unit. So team of prosecutors that do this day in, day out in Arapahoe. I ran that largest team. And now I run the all three offices for Douglas, Elbert, and Lincoln counties. So serving over 400,000 people, seeking justice for them.
So when people in the community are asking for like reform, are those policies started in the DA's office? Are they policies started in the legislature? Or are they policies that are created in the police or sheriff's office? Where do people?
All three. In all seriousness, all three. And so I'll talk about a bunch of it here. So in the office, one of the things that I have done personally was I helped start a veterans treatment court. And this is something that you have, the sway over potentially as a district attorney. So the Veterans Treatment Court is this specialty court that we brought in place for people that were high risk, high need. So they were looking at going to prison, and instead of sending them to prison, we created a program to help rehabilitate them. So these are people who are struggling from things like PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, substance abuse related to their service, right? And what we tried to do was create this wraparound system of interlocking resources and then community members who would help them get to all their appointments, help them get a job, have somebody to call and talk to when they're struggling, encourage them to succeed with the monitored sobriety. And with our program graduates, we have less than 5% recidivism for this. This is incredible because the average recidivism is 40 to 50% across the board. So a lot of other programs are not working well, but this kind of thing does. Now, that's not something I obviously created on my own. I would never pretend like I did this all by myself. I was a part of it. As somebody who worked with and problem solved with judges, the defense bar, treatment providers to bring this together. So that's us working inside the system without new legislation. And so now we have a drug treatment court, we've got a mental health treatment court, we've got a DUI treatment court, and of course the Veterans Court. All of these things are doing some dramatic work on behalf of our community and to try and make offenders less likely to reoffend. So that's something internal, right? And then there's working outside. I mean, working with the legislature. There's big changes that the legislature can do. Somebody with experience like me last year actually worked with Senator Fields, Rhonda Fields from Aurora. I saw an issue with the law that basically allowed people that could potentially intimidate witnesses or prevent testimony from coming into court. And if they did that, guess what? That evidence wasn't going to come in. You weren't going to necessarily be able to hear from it. The jury's deprived from something that helps them seek the truth. And I worked with Senator Fields. I said, can we help change this? She said, yes, I want to sponsor this bill. So I drafted it, worked with Representative Roberts, another Democrat. And look, I'm a Republican, but this is why I say this shouldn't matter. It's not a partisan thing where you're talking about justice and making our process and system better. Ended up testifying in front of both the Senate and the House Judiciary Committees. Ran into a snag where the defense bar said, we don't like this. I said, well, let's work it out. So we sat down, we basically hashed out some language to make it something that was acceptable to them. And they said, okay, we'll stay neutral on it. And then it passed. It got nearly passed unanimously in the House and the Senate and signed into law by Jared Polis. And that's criminal justice reform. And it's working across the aisle. It's being smart about doing something that's good for everybody. So I think if you're talking about where does reform happen, it's everywhere you have the ability to touch the system.
And I know you're committed to not showing any bias. I mean, you're not afraid to prosecute anybody in law enforcement who's violated the law. I mean, you realize, I've heard you say nobody's above the law. And so again, that's really comforting to know that you're not just saying it, but you've done it. You've held everybody accountable for their actions. And I think that's really important for voters to know that that's something that you're committed to. And this is a great segue because you talked a little bit about school safety, and I would encourage people to go to your website, John Kellner. It's johnkellner.com, right?
Yeah, it's really
really easy to remember. And you have a tab where you talk about school safety. I'm a public school teacher and a parent as well. And for 27 years, I've had to protect students, other people's children. And it's unfortunate that we've gotten to a point where we're not just doing fire drills anymore. We're doing active shooter drills, right? Like that's where we're at. And every day that I go to work, it can be a day where I might have to put my physical body in between an active shooter and somebody else's child. And that's fine. That's a risk I'm willing to take. But let's talk about school safety. I'm going to read a little bit from your website that I thought is really amazing. You said one of your key takeaways of the Secret Service report is the need for early intervention with students in crisis. Early intervention and school violence prevention is made possible by a well-defined and collaborative threat assessment process, including input from school personnel, law enforcement, mental health professionals, parents, and other experts. This is so important because when appropriate, we can use the justice system to help by providing professional monitoring, counseling, and rehabilitation.
Mhm.
And I think that sums up with the conversation around helping young people. We call it restorative justice.
Yeah.
That's kind of the pathway that we've started taking. Talk about diversion
Yeah.
in your department.
Yeah, well, I'm going to loop back to something you said earlier, Priscilla, which is that you might, as a teacher, put yourself in harm's way for kids. And I just, really respect you and thank you for having that mindset and doing that job anyway, because I know it's not what a lot of teachers signed up for. When you thought, I want to go teach kids, it was not this idea that we might have to deal with school violence too. And I mean, it's near and dear to my heart. I've got two kids in public school um, in our community. And I think about it all the time. I think like most parents, we've got some text or email that said your school's on lockdown and you're wondering, oh my God, what's going on? Do I need to go rush over there? And of course you do, right? I don't think anybody should have to live like that. And I saw this really up close and personal early on in my time here at the DA's office because the Arapahoe High School shooting happened and a young lady named Claire Davis was killed. And it was senseless and horrible. And, our role as the DA was we're helping law enforcement look into this to find out, was anybody else involved? Are there any more threats to kids? What else is there out there? What can we learn from this tragedy? And of course, there was some legislation that was passed about it, and there was a big report that was issued. And one of the things that always jumped out at me was this particular student had made some threats. This particular student had, it's one of those things where afterwards people are like, yep, yeah, I figured it would be that person, right? And that's one of the things the Secret Service report talks about is 93% of people that commit these crimes, there had been some discussion of it earlier. There had been maybe either a cry for help or somebody, a warning sign, and nobody talked about it or it just wasn't followed up on. And that's what happened in the Arapahoe High School is, this young person, there was a threat assessment and it didn't include the district attorney's office. And that was one of the takeaways from the report, which was, look, I think the DAs need to be involved with this because we see at a much different level across the entire, not just a school district, all the school districts, all 4 counties out here, a lot more of trends, a lot more of what's happening in different schools. And I think we at least bring something valuable in terms of our knowledge of the justice system to the table because you asked about diversion. And diversion that we have for the juvenile diversion process is fantastic. I think we are the leader in the entire state. Recidivism is around 7% for kids that go through diversion. It's for low level first, second time offenders. Kids make mistakes. I mean, and nobody wants that to define their lives. And they don't want to create a paper trail that's going to follow a kid around forever. And so our diversion program, we go through about 500 kids a year, right? And that's huge. We've got 15 master's level therapists that work in-house in our diversion program to make sure that kids have access to the resources. And why that matters, Priscilla, is that in-house services help take out that variable of, can you pay for it? Can your insurance pay for it? Right? Think about that. So if you've got programs that are not set up in this kind of way, what happens is, hey, guess what? This wealthy kid can pay for his own mental health treatment, so he's going to get diversion. That's inequitable. We took that out by doing it in-house and providing those services ourselves to make sure that nobody's being denied access because they can't, afford some of the treatment resources. But we do a lot of what you mentioned in terms of restorative justice. That's always a component of diversion. It's a lot about talking out the harm that was caused and getting kids to recognize, okay, where was the bad decision making? How did it harm somebody else? What can I do to fix that harm? And trying to learn from it, right? It's trying to make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen again.
Yeah, I know we're spending a lot of time in Denver Public Schools where I teach with this process to hopefully um, mitigate further bad behavior or damaging behavior, I should say. We're still learning, and um, I think it's important for parents and students to know that they need to call someone or tell someone if they hear or see something that is off, so that officials and can can look into the situation before it does result in something like a school shooting or some bad behavior out in the community. So we know that there are times where juveniles are tried as adults when they're not 18. How does the DA's office decide when to charge a minor as an adult?
That's a extremely difficult decision to make. I can tell you, I'm aware of very few times we do that, and it generally involves something as serious as a murder. A juvenile commits a homicide, they're 17, 16, will that be the appropriate time to charge them as an adult? It always depends on everything about the case, about the individual, about their background, about prior attempts at rehabilitation, maybe whether or not they've been through the juvenile justice system before, but not always a murder. I mean, that's generally what I would say. But I have a case that I'm working on right now where there's a young man who was just nearly 18. He's currently charged as an adult, and the judge agreed that it was appropriate to charge him as an adult. But he allegedly shot a police officer during a home invasion robbery. Again, all allegations. I'm not going to talk about his name or anything, but those are the weighty decisions you have to make. And I will tell you, the justice system is designed to ensure that that's not a rush to judgment. Because I think as a prosecutor, you got to look at all the facts and you talk to their advocate, so the defense attorney, to learn more about the issues on the other side of that coin. And in that particular case, we had, I want to say, 3 days of hearings just for the judge to decide whether or not it was appropriate for the case to stay in district court, adult court. And the judge decided that it was. That's a lot of court time to spend to make sure that the right process is being followed. So it's not something I take lightly by any stretch. It's something, a bit of a contrast with my opponent. She had said on many occasions that she would never, charge a juvenile as an adult, full stop. And that has changed. She recently did an interview that said, well, maybe there's sometimes. I think that maybe change comes from not having had the experience that I've had dealing with both juveniles and adults, and the consequences of both the systems. And I look at something as horrible as the STEM school shooting, right, where there was a young person, not quite 18, but close to it, right, and ended up, causing the death of a real hero, a young man named Kendrick Castillo, right? And when I heard my opponent say she would categorically never use that potential tool, it made me think that, there's a lack of understanding about some of the issues that we have in our community, especially related to things like school violence.
I mean, you definitely, there's definitely not a one size fits all for cases. You talked a little bit about being really cautious around creating new policies. And sometimes when you write a policy, you can restrict yourself, right? Talk a little bit about how you decide when something's appropriate for a policy, and why you think sometimes it's not always the best decision.
Yeah. So, our job as prosecutors is to evaluate each case on their own merits. So each defendant is different. Each victim is different. The harm caused is not always going to be the same. The people's history on both sides, these things all matter. You got to take everything into account. So what we try to do is not say, here is, you commit X and then the outcome is going to be Y, because we know that there's so many different grades. Even think about something as simple as a DUI. There's a difference between a 0.08 and a 0.20, right? A dramatic difference. And you have to have grades of decision making there. So what we try to do is create good decision makers. We want to develop good judgment in our young prosecutors to evaluate all those things and then come up with what should be justice or what they believe is justice and present it to a judge to then decide, does the judge agree that this is a just outcome? And I'll tell you a quick story. Quick, maybe not the right word, but I'll tell you a story. So when I was a young prosecutor in the Marine Corps, I remember this case involving, senior enlisted person who had come back from a couple different deployments and now was struggling. He had popped positive for, I think it was meth or cocaine, maybe both. I'm not quite sure on that detail, and had done some other things that violated sort of our code of ethics, our code of honor in the Marine Corps. And the command wanted to kick him out. In our prosecutor shop, we talked about it a lot. What's the right outcome? Because you want to make sure that you're setting the standard for the young Marines, right? You want the leaders to set the standard for everybody to follow. And we kind of worked ourselves up thinking, yeah, this person needs to get kicked out of the Marine Corps. And I remember being in the courtroom and hearing the argument about kicking this guy out. And thankfully, the judge looked at the young prosecutors and said, no. And he said, look, we're going to bust you down a rank and we're going to try to help you. And if you want to help yourself, then it'll be better for everybody because we owe something to you to help try and fix you. And he talked to us afterwards, this judge, like, look, you guys got to get some perspective. This isn't the crime of the century. And you ought to be thinking about, how to maybe fix this and help this person because we don't want to leave anybody behind. Marines never leave anybody behind. And I thought about it for a while and I thought that judge is wrong. And then I saw that Marine in Afghanistan. Right? I saw him years later leading Marines and bringing them back home safe in a combat zone where our regiment lost 70 Marines, in the time that they were out there. And to see somebody maybe that could have been kicked out instead of bringing that experience to help young people come back alive, that makes you realize just how much potential power you have as a prosecutor and how you have to exercise it with such care and judgment. And so I talked to a lot of my young people about this and trying to help develop their decision making and their judgment, so that they can make these decisions on their own. That's the kind of experience and leadership I bring to this office.
So should you be elected this November, what would you do better or hope to accomplish in your role?
Well, I mentioned to you earlier, those problem-solving courts. That is something I'm really passionate about, trying to expand. I told you I helped start the Veterans Treatment Court, but I also am our policy board member for the DA's office with the judges and the head of the public defender's office and the treatment providers and the probation office to set all those policies for the drug treatment court, the mental health court, the DUI court, the vet court, because I really believe in them. And I think they are an effective way for us to try and, deal with things like the opioid crisis. Like it's hard to, see right now because people are a lot more disconnected because of the pandemic, but the opioid crisis is still going on and it's gotten, from what I can tell, worse, with a lot of people have been struggling to get access to, their treatment resources, their support networks to kind of help keep them on track. And so there's no way we're going to incarcerate our way out of the opioid epidemic. That's not going to happen. But treatment resources like these courts, something I'm committed to expanding access to. I will say, public safety is absolutely number one, and that is the top job of the district attorney. And I told you earlier about some of the rising violent crime that we have. It has to be dealt with. It has to be dealt with smartly and frankly, as quickly as possible. And I have experience, I have prosecuted cases involving basically dismantling gangs, dismantling drug trafficking organizations. And not long ago, I've been working on several cases involving illegal guns and the illegal gun trade that we see is pretty prevalent in Aurora. So typically when there's a shooting and if we recover the gun or the shell casings, we find out that person did not lawfully buy that gun in a gun shop. And I bought it somewhere, sometimes through Facebook, sometimes through Craigslist, sometimes through somebody they meet on a street corner. And we have resources to go after this sort of gun trade. And I've done that with a particular case where we ended up not just arresting, the one person who possessed it, but tracing it back to who sold it to him, then who sold it to him, and then who sold it to him, and everybody in that line being held accountable under the law. I think that's how we're going to get some of this rising violent crime and shootings under control in Aurora.
Something that's controversial, a conversation, is SROs in the schools. In Denver Public Schools, the school board voted to eliminate SROs. 14 of the 16 were SROs of color. And we've seen testimony for and against getting rid of SROs in public schools. I think it's important to know, like, my experience in education, and 3 of those years I was a full-time principal and built amazing relationships with sheriffs and troopers and police officers, because in many, many cases, our SROs are like surrogate parents to our people who are under the most trauma. And they have been able to divert bad behavior and mentor young people and explain to them about how important it is for them to change their actions because of what it could lead to. And one of my concerns as a public school teacher, like when we go back to school, is that if something happens in the school, a child brings a weapon, a child gets high in the stairwell, a fight breaks out, something that I'm not really trained to handle. But a lot of teachers are wondering, where the limit is, right? There's conversations about, like, should teachers have guns in schools, and like what are the ramifications of that? Like, so the conversation is all over the place. I don't think we have an answer yet, but it is a conversation. Like, what are some things that you're hearing in this conversation around SROs in and out of schools?
I think number one, teachers should be focused on educating and not have to be focused on being law enforcement by any stretch in a school setting. I would say this. I mean, I think it's pretty disappointing. The decision was made, and made pretty hastily, it seems, to take SROs out of Denver public schools, especially, as you say, having had such great relationships with so many kids and trying to be a positive influence in their lives. I think SROs are an invaluable part of this whole school safety puzzle, essentially. I favor sort of an all of the above approach to ensuring our kids, like mine and my friends and all these other kids that we see going to Cherry Creek School District or Littleton Public Schools or Arapahoe Public Schools or Aurora Public Schools, Douglas County, they ought to be safe. And sometimes if something really bad happens, the SRO is right there to help. And that happened in the Arapahoe school shooting. As soon as the gunshot rang out, that SRO wasn't running away. He was running towards that sound. And he chased after the shooter and, was able to essentially neutralize that shooter because the SRO was there. And I believe very firmly that he saved a lot of other kids' lives that day. And I just don't think that that's a hasty discussion that should ever be made, or a hasty decision, or a quick discussion about whether to take them out. So I actually have similar experiences to you in terms of my relationships with SROs, especially in Aurora Public Schools. These are people that are specially trained, so that they don't just come off the street. I mean, they are specially trained to be SROs, and they fight for that job. I mean, this isn't something that people get as a, hey, who doesn't want to be an SRO? And the last person to raise their hand. It's people ask for that. They're passionate about helping kids. And a lot of these people, I mean, they work specifically at gang intervention to ensure that kids aren't getting bad influences and kind of going down a bad path. I don't know any SROs that are thinking, hey, today I want to go arrest a kid. They're thinking every morning, how can I help a kid today? That's been my experience. I mean, and I've seen it time and time again. So I hope that's not a movement that takes root in Arapahoe, Douglas, Elbert, or Lincoln counties. And I really hope Denver reconsiders that.
Yeah, I think we need to definitely continue the conversation. I know, like, we can all improve, and we have great law enforcement, and every now and again, just like in any profession, you have great people and then you have some bad apples. And I don't think anybody's in denial about that. So we definitely want to make sure our law enforcement know they're supported, but we also have a higher expectation, right? A higher standard for our law enforcement, just like you have for teachers. There's like, I have to live by a higher standard as a public school teacher than just a everyday
And we
person.
should expect that from people that we give the authority to carry a gun and wear a badge on their chest. We should expect higher and more from them. And by and large, I'll tell you, my experience with law enforcement is they try to hold themselves to that higher standard. And there shouldn't be any sort of weakening, right? There shouldn't be a desire to make it easier. It should be, we're going to hold people to a higher standard, and I think they want to meet that.
Yeah, I mean, something that I'm seeing in social media is like defund the police, and I always connect everything to education. Like if I ever heard someone say defund education,
Yeah.
I would be like, why would you do that? If you like, if so, children here are not learning to read and write, we should defund them. Or a teacher was caught doing something naughty with a child, like, so we should defund. Like, to me, that doesn't make sense to use that language or to move in that direction. I think the important thing is just to talk to policymakers, look at the practices, make modifications that are going to diffuse situations. I mean, that was like the number one thing I learned when I was a principal in Alaska, talking with the troopers. Like, my job is to like neutralize and diffuse, high volatile situations. And I was like, that stuck with me. Like, that's what I look for, and that's what I expect from law enforcement when they go into a crisis situation.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you on that. I mean, the answer is usually not defund, it's better train and maybe better fund to get what you expect, right? To get the standard met that you want. And it's absolutely a discussion. I mean, I know you've mentioned this many times about continuing a discussion. Like, nobody should accept, less than excellence, right, from our law enforcement officers. And what we need to do is figure out ways to help them meet that expectation, not defund, not take away resources, but ensure that they have everything they need to do the job properly and to do it the way that the public expects. And I'd say it sounds like the same thing for teachers.
Mm-hmm. Well, so here's my next question. I think this might be a tough one for you. Like, what is an
Sure.
accomplishment you've had that makes you the most proud?
I'm sorry, say it again.
What's an accomplishment that you've had that makes you the most proud?
Well, I would, I guess, stick to court at this point. I mean, I'm assuming we're talking about that. Things I'm most proud about are my kids, 7 and 8 years old, and you know, like my daughter just the other day, brings me a little note that says, "I believe in you," and she knows that this is the tough time of campaigning, right? Like, this is the crunch time and in the sprint to the end. And just I love them. I'm so proud of those little ones. But in terms of being a prosecutor, it's helping people that kind of thought that justice was lost. I told you about the Sudanese refugee case, and that's one. And there's another. I mean, there's many others, but one that comes to mind is this young man in Aurora who was an undocumented immigrant. He was working at a restaurant, met some people. They seemed nice. He invited him back to his apartment. They're hanging out, having a Corona, having a beer, just really hanging out. And it turns violent. It turns out one of them was there to rob and ultimately shot and killed this young man. And it's another cold case. And it's one of those that, nobody was clamoring for, right? There's not some big media interest, but the detective never gave up on it. He brought me in and we worked together, and we decided we were going to charge the person that we thought committed the crime, ended up convicting that person of first degree murder. And, again, this young man's brother, who also undocumented, right? He thought nobody would ever care and nobody would ever do anything about it. And it's just to show them and tell them that, yes, this justice system is here for you too. It's here for all of us. And it's cases like that. It's conversations with victims and family members where you get to tell them, we are going to seek justice for you, and we've never given up on it. That's the thing I'm most proud of.
I can't imagine living the life you live, the career that you have, and seeing all the trauma that you have to see and deal with, and still having some kind of joy in your life. And the fact that you're running for an elective office. Okay, first of all, thank you for running for an elective office. I know what that's like, and is very challenging some days because you're highly criticized. People can mischaracterize who you are. We see this all the time in politics, and the fact that you know this is the path, and you are running for an office. Like, we need good people to run for elective office all the way down the ballot, and DA is one of those offices where a lot of people don't know much about. Like, they hear about the president and maybe senator, and like then you go down the ballot and people are like, I don't know who this person is.
Absolutely.
And so I'm really glad that we're having this opportunity for people to know who you are as a DA, but just as a person. So during this time of COVID, like, what's something that's brought joy to you or put a smile on your face to balance out all of this work that you're doing?
I would say the extra time with my family. We've come up with some great things, like WebEx Court, which, look, I used to go to court almost every single day, and my people were in physical court almost every single day. And when things shut down entirely, we were really obviously concerned about this big backlog of cases, and created this system on the fly, working with the judges and the defense bar and the sheriffs and law enforcement to be able to have hearings and to kind of do some business on WebEx. And that's made things so much better for a lot of families to be able to be more present at home. So I'm frankly pretty blessed to have that opportunity. I hope it's something we actually keep, especially for people that, look, there's a lot of defendants and people and victims that want to get to court, but they can't because of work, and they got to take 3 buses to get there. Like, we ought to have ways to make sure people can attend and not hold that against them if they can get on WebEx and do it the same way. But I'll tell you, the thing that brought the biggest joy to me recently was that the kids got to go back to school full time, and they were so ecstatic. Like, they could not have been happier that they were going to be around their friends again, see their friends, and it's just been great so far. So,
yay! I'm excited to go back. We're still 100% remote, but I'm hoping we go back. Okay, we're gonna do real easy, fun, this or that. Okay, you have 2 choices, this or that. Okay, so your first one is mountains or beach.
Mountains.
Okay, okay, summer or winter?
Winter. Winter sports.
Okay, I think this will be my last one. Beer or wine?
Beer.
Okay, all right, there we go. Our next DA, John Kellner. Please go to his website, johnkellner.com. He still needs volunteers. They're door knocking all the time, phone calls, letters. Invite him for a meet and greet. Go to a meet and greet. Make a donation. Open your wallet and give him some money, because he has to, like,
we're in the home stretch. Anything helps. Everything helps.
$5, $10, $400. We've said this 1,000 times. $400 is the max.
That's right. Okay,
but if you're married, then it could be $800.
Sure could.
So thank you so much for being so generous with your time, and thank you for all that you're doing for the justice system.